Hyperinflation, when prices spiral out of control and currency loses value so rapidly that people spend it immediately before it becomes worthless. When money is literally used as wallpaper because it's cheaper than actual wallpaper. When workers demand to be paid multiple times daily because their wages lose half their value by evening. When the price of bread might double between morning and afternoon. When wheelbarrows full of cash are needed to buy groceries and the wheelbarrow itself is worth more than the money it carries. This isn't theoretical dystopia or ancient history. It has happened repeatedly in modern times. Most famously in Weimar Germany in 1923 when the mark collapsed so completely that a loaf of bread cost billions of marks. But also in Hungary in 1946 with the worst hyperinflation ever recorded. In Zimbabwe in 2008 when inflation hit 79.6 billion% monthly. In Venezuela in recent years, and in numerous other cases across the 20th and 21st centuries. And these episodes weren't natural disasters or acts of God. They were policy failures, were the predictable results of governments printing money to finance spending without regard for consequences, usually to pay war debts or to avoid unpopular tax increases or to maintain political power when economic reality would otherwise force painful choices. And hyperinflation destroys not just the currency, but the entire social contract, wipes out savings, makes planning impossible, transfers wealth chaotically from savers to debtors, from wage earners to asset owners, from the prudent to the opportunistic, creates black markets in crime and social breakdown. And the psychological trauma persists for generations. Germans who lived through Weimar hyperinflation remain terrified of inflation decades later, influenced Bundesbank policy toward extreme conservatism, shaped German opposition to euro monetary expansion, and understanding how hyperinflation happens, what triggers it, why governments let it continue even as it destroys their economies, and what the human costs are when money becomes worthless. This reveals fundamental truths about monetary systems, about the relationship between government legitimacy and currency credibility, about how quickly trust can collapse, and about the political and social chaos that follows when the medium of exchange stops functioning, making hyperinflation not just an economic phenomenon, but a civilizational crisis that demonstrates what happens when states fail to maintain the most basic public good, stable money. The Weimar hyperinflation began with World War I. Germany financed the war largely through borrowing rather than through taxation, accumulating enormous debts in marks. And the strategy was based on expectation of victory, the assumption being that defeated enemies would pay reparations that would cover the debts. But Germany lost, and the Versailles Treaty imposed reparations on Germany instead, required paying the Allies 132 billion gold marks, an enormous sum that German capacity to pay was questionable. And the new Weimar Republic, established after the Kaiser's abdication, inherited this debt burden along with the war debts accumulated during fighting, and the government faced impossible choices. Raise taxes dramatically, which would be politically suicidal, default on debts which would destroy international credit, or inflate, print money to pay debts, and the government chose inflation. The Reichsbank printed marks to cover government spending, and initially this seemed manageable. Prices rose, but not catastrophically, and the inflation actually helped the government by reducing the real value of its debts. Borrowers who owed fixed amounts in marks could repay with inflated currency worth less, but the process became self-reinforcing. As inflation accelerated, people lost confidence in the mark, began demanding higher wages and prices, began converting marks to foreign currency or to real assets, and this increased velocity of money, people spending immediately rather than holding cash, and increased velocity accelerated inflation further, creating a spiral where inflation caused behavior that caused more inflation, and by 1923 this spiral had become hyperinflation, completely out of control, destroying the currency. The mechanics of Weimar hyperinflation were that government spending exceeded tax revenues by enormous margins. The deficit in 1923 was over 50% of spending, and this deficit was financed entirely by printing money. The Reichsbank simply created marks to cover government obligations, and the quantity of marks in circulation exploded. From 29 billion in 1919 to 497 quintillion by November 1923, an increase of over a trillion-fold in less than 5 years, and with money supply increasing. While production was stagnant or declining, prices exploded. The exchange rate went from 4.2 marks per dollar in 1914 to 4.2 trillion marks per dollar in November 1923. Bread that cost less than a mark in 1918 cost 200 billion marks in late 1923. A postage stamp cost billions. Wages were in the trillions and quadrillions. And people needed wheelbarrows or suitcases full of cash for basic purchases, and the social effects were devastating. Anyone with savings saw them wiped out, a lifetime's. Accumulation became worthless overnight. Pensions became meaningless. Insurance policies became jokes. Bonds and mortgages and bank deposits all lost essentially all value. And this destroyed the middle class. People who had lived comfortably on savings or pensions or investments became impoverished, while people with debts or physical assets or access to foreign currency benefited enormously. Borrowed money in marks and repaid it with worthless currency, bought assets with inflated marks and sold for foreign currency. So hyperinflation caused the largest transfer of wealth in German history. Arbitrary, chaotic, destroying social cohesion and creating resentments that would poison Weimar politics and contribute to the rise of extremism. The human dimension of hyperinflation is captured in contemporary accounts. People describe carrying baskets or wheelbarrows of cash to buy bread, describe prices changing while they waited in line, shopkeepers updating prices multiple times daily, describe money literally being used as wallpaper or fuel because it was cheaper than actual wallpaper or firewood, children playing with stacks of billion-mark notes because they were worthless, and the breakdown of normal economic life. Businesses couldn't plan, couldn't price goods, couldn't maintain inventories because replacement costs were unknown. Workers went on strike constantly demanding wage increases that couldn't keep up with price increases. Employers paid workers multiple times daily so wages wouldn't lose too much value. Restaurants charged one price when you ordered and a different price when you paid, and foreign currency became the real money. Dollars and Swiss francs and British pounds traded at huge premiums became the medium for any serious transaction. While marks were used only for immediate spending and black markets flourished, goods were hoarded and sold illegally for foreign currency. Crime exploded as people resorted to theft to survive. Prostitution and smuggling and black marketeering became widespread. Social norms collapsed as survival took precedence over morality, and the political effects were polarization. Both communists and fascists gained support by promising to restore order and punish those responsible. The moderate parties that had governed Weimar were discredited. Democracy itself was associated with chaos and failure. And while hyperinflation ended in late 1923 when the Rentenmark was introduced, backed by land and by commitment to fiscal discipline, the social and political damage persisted. The middle class never fully recovered their trust in government or currency or democracy, and this trauma contributed directly to the conditions that brought Hitler to power. A decade later, Hungary's hyperinflation in 1946 was even more extreme, the worst ever recorded. The pengo depreciated so rapidly that prices doubled every 15 hours at the peak. The total increase in prices from 1945 to 1946 was approximately 41.9 quadrillion percent. Numbers so large they become meaningless, and the mechanics were similar to Weimar. Post-war government with massive debts and destroyed productive capacity, printing money to cover spending, creating spiral of inflation and currency collapse. But Hungary's case was complicated by Soviet occupation. The Soviet army looted Hungarian industry, demanded reparations, extracted resources, and the Hungarian government printed money partly to pay Soviet demands, couldn't tax a devastated economy, couldn't borrow because nobody would lend, so printed pengos to cover expenses. And the hyperinflation that resulted was so severe that the government introduced new denominations. The milpengo worth 1,000,000 pengos, then the bilpengo worth a trillion pengos, then the adopted pengo worth 2 quintillion pengos, numbers that had never been used in currency before, and economic activity essentially stopped. People reverted to barter, wages were paid in kind, farmers refused to sell food for currency, only for goods. The economy primitivized, returned to pre-monetary exchange. And the crisis ended only when the forint was introduced in August 1946, with credible backing and fiscal discipline. But the damage was severe, savings destroyed. Trust in currency shattered, economic activity depressed for years. Zimbabwe's hyperinflation in the 2000s demonstrated that these crises aren't just historical, can occur in modern economies, and the causes were land reform and political corruption. Mugabe's government seized white-owned farms and redistributed them to political supporters who lacked farming expertise. Agricultural production collapsed. Zimbabwe went from breadbasket to basket case. Exports fell. Foreign currency earnings disappeared, and government spending continued, financed by printing Zimbabwe dollars. And inflation accelerated, reached 79.6 billion % per month by November 2008, prices doubling every 24 hours, and the government responded by printing higher denomination notes, eventually issuing a 100 trillion Zimbabwe dollar note, the highest denomination currency ever officially issued. And this note was worth less than $1 US at parallel market rates. And the economy collapsed. Unemployment exceeded 90%. People fled the country. Essential services broke down. The government couldn't pay civil servants, couldn't maintain infrastructure, and Zimbabwe essentially abandoned its currency, dollarized, began using US dollars and South African rand. And while this stopped hyperinflation, it created different problems. Without control over currency, Zimbabwe couldn't conduct monetary policy, couldn't devalue to boost exports, was subject to external monetary conditions, and recovery has been slow and difficult, demonstrating that hyperinflation doesn't just destroy currency, it destroys institutional capacity, destroys trust that takes generations to rebuild. Venezuela's more recent hyperinflation follows similar patterns: socialist government with massive spending commitments, declining oil production and revenues, inability or unwillingness to cut spending or raise taxes, printing bolivars to finance deficits, and inflation accelerating from high to hyper. Officially measured inflation exceeded 130,000% in 2018. Though actual inflation was probably higher, and the social effects have been catastrophic, millions have fled the country. Poverty has exploded, healthcare system has collapsed, crime is endemic, basic goods are unavailable or unaffordable. People have lost dramatic amounts of weight from malnutrition. Diseases that had been eliminated have returned, and the government has responded with denial and repression, jailing economists who publish independent inflation estimates, imposing price controls that create shortages, creating multiple exchange rates that spawn corruption, and the economy has contracted by over 75% since 2013, one of the largest peacetime economic collapses in history, comparable to Weimar or to the Great Depression. And recovery will require not just stabilizing currency, but rebuilding institutions, restoring rule of law, creating conditions where people trust government and currency again. And this will take years or decades, assuming it happens at all. The common pattern across all hyperinflations is that they begin with governments spending far beyond revenues, usually because of war or political instability or populist promises that can't be afforded, and governments choose to print money rather than to raise taxes or cut spending, because printing money is politically easier in the short term, doesn't require legislative approval, doesn't create immediate opposition, and initially seems painless. Prices rise gradually, people adjust. The economy continues functioning, but at some threshold, confidence breaks. People realize the government won't stop printing, realize the currency will continue losing value, and they act to protect themselves, convert currency to foreign currency or to real assets, spend immediately rather than holding cash. And this behavior accelerates inflation, and once hyperinflation starts, stopping it requires draconian measures, requires government to commit credibly to stop printing money, requires fiscal discipline, balanced budgets or near balanced, requires creating new currency with genuine backing, and requires political will to accept pain in the short term, unemployment and recession and austerity, to achieve stability in the long term. And governments in hyperinflation are often too weak or too corrupt or too politically constrained to take these measures. So hyperinflation continues until complete collapse forces action, until the currency becomes so worthless that it stops functioning, until barter replaces monetary exchange, until economic activity declines so far that political survival is threatened, and only then, in crisis, can reforms be implemented. The distributional effects of hyperinflation are severe and arbitrary. Debtors benefit enormously. Anyone who borrowed money can repay with worthless currency. Mortgages are eliminated, loans disappear, business debts evaporate, and this is windfall gain for borrowers, while creditors, people who lent money or who hold bonds or deposits, lose everything. Savings are destroyed, pension funds become worthless, insurance policies pay nothing, and this transfers wealth from savers to borrowers. From the prudent to the opportunistic, from old to young, from middle class to those with debts or access to hard assets. And wage earners suffer because wages lag behind prices. By the time workers get paid and spend their wages, prices have risen, so real wages collapse. Workers become impoverished even if nominally employed, while people with access to foreign currency or with real assets benefit, can buy undervalued assets with foreign currency, can sell assets for foreign currency, can arbitrage the chaos, and the wealthy generally have more ability to protect themselves, have foreign bank accounts, have assets abroad, have resources to flee if necessary, while the poor and middle class are trapped, have nowhere to go, no assets to protect, and bear the full costs of currency collapse. So hyperinflation increases inequality dramatically, destroys the middle class, concentrates wealth among those positioned to exploit the chaos, and creates social resentment that poisons politics for generations. The political consequences of hyperinflation are regime change. Almost universally, governments that preside over hyperinflation lose legitimacy, are seen as incompetent or corrupt, are blamed for the suffering even if the roots of the crisis predate them. Weimar democracy was discredited. Venezuelan socialism is discredited. Zimbabwean government lost international legitimacy, even if it maintained domestic control, and hyperinflation creates conditions for extremism, people desperate for stability and order become willing to support authoritarian solutions, to trade freedom for the promise of stability, to support demagogues who promise simple solutions. And this is why hyperinflation is so dangerous politically. It's not just economic crisis, but legitimacy crisis of confidence in institutions and in government's basic competence. And recovering from this requires not just economic stabilization, but political transformation, often requires regime change, requires new leadership that can credibly commit to different policies, requires rebuilding trust that has been destroyed, and this is difficult, takes years, and isn't always successful. Zimbabwe hasn't recovered. Venezuela is still in crisis. And even successful stabilizations like Germany in 1923 required political changes and left lasting scars. The question of why governments allow hyperinflation to continue when the costs are so obvious has multiple answers. First, stopping it requires painful measures that governments are reluctant to impose, requires cutting spending, which means cutting politically important programs, requires raising taxes, which is unpopular, requires accepting recession and unemployment, and governments, especially weak or illegitimate governments, often can impose these costs, fear that doing so will trigger political collapse, riots, coups, so they continue printing money, choosing slow-motion disaster over immediate crisis. Second, hyperinflation benefits some constituents, benefits debtors and people positioned to exploit currency chaos, and these beneficiaries resist stabilization, lobby to continue inflation, and may be politically powerful. Third, there's often genuine confusion about what's happening and what to do, especially in early stages. Economists disagree, policymakers receive conflicting advice. The magnitude of the problem isn't clear, and by the time it's undeniable, the situation is so bad that solutions are extremely painful. Fourth, hyperinflation often occurs during political chaos, wars, revolutions, regime transitions, and governments lack the capacity or authority to implement solutions even if they understand what's needed. So the crisis continues until complete collapse forces action or until external intervention provides solution. The exits from hyperinflation require currency reform. Creating new currency with credible backing typically involves massive devaluation. Old currency exchanged for new at rates like 1 million old to 1 new, or 1 trillion to 1. Ratios that reflect how much value is lost, and the new currency needs backing, needs something that makes people believe it will hold value. Traditionally, this was gold or foreign currency or land. The Rentenmark that ended Weimar hyperinflation was nominally backed by land, though the backing was largely symbolic. More important was the commitment to stop printing money, to balance the budget. And this commitment had to be credible, had to convince people that the government wouldn't simply inflate the new currency the way it inflated the old. And credibility usually required external support. Weimar stabilization was supported by American loans. Venezuelan stabilization attempts have failed partly from lack of external support and credibility. Also required political change, new leadership or new regime that wasn't associated with the policies that caused hyperinflation, that could claim a fresh start. And even with all these elements, stabilization was painful, required period of tight money, recession, high unemployment, social hardship, but was necessary to break inflation expectations, to convince people that currency would hold value. And successful stabilizations created foundations for recovery. Germany, after 1923, grew rapidly. Until the Depression, but unsuccessful attempts left countries in prolonged crisis, unable to stabilize, unable to grow, trapped in cycles of inflation and political instability. The modern relevance is that hyperinflation remains possible. Monetary systems are still vulnerable to government abuse. Currencies still depend on trust that can collapse. Venezuela and Zimbabwe demonstrate this isn't ancient history. And the proliferation of cryptocurrency is partly response to fears of currency debasement, people seeking assets that governments can't inflate, digital gold that can't be printed. And these fears are grounded in history, in repeated examples of governments destroying currencies. And while developed countries with independent central banks seem less vulnerable, the risks exist. Large government debts create pressure to inflate. Political resistance to fiscal discipline creates temptation to print money. And if confidence in central bank independence were lost, if political pressure forced monetary financing of deficits, hyperinflation could occur even in advanced economies. And the economic damage would be catastrophic, far worse than in Weimar or Zimbabwe, because modern economies are more complex, more dependent on financial systems, more vulnerable to breakdown of monetary exchange. So understanding hyperinflation isn't just historical interest. It's warning about what can happen when monetary discipline fails, when governments prioritize short-term political survival over long-term stability, when institutions fail to constrain political pressure to print money, and when trust in currency collapses, when money turns into wallpaper, when wheelbarrows full of cash can't buy bread, when the medium of exchange stops functioning and economic life reverts to barter and chaos, demonstrating that monetary stability is a public good that requires constant vigilance, requires institutions that can resist political pressure, requires fiscal discipline and credible commitment not to abuse the printing press. And when these requirements aren't met, when governments choose to print their way out of fiscal problems, the result is hyperinflation, destroying not just currency but trust, not just savings but social cohesion, not just the economy but the legitimacy of the state itself, making hyperinflation one of the most destructive economic phenomena, a crisis that leaves scars lasting generations, that shapes political culture and economic policy for decades, that serves as warning about the fragility of monetary systems and about the catastrophic consequences when governments fail to maintain the basic public good of stable money. Consequences that include not just economic hardship, but social breakdown and political radicalization and the destruction of the middle class and the transfer of wealth to opportunists and the impoverishment of the vulnerable and the breakdown of trust in institutions and in each other, all of which follows inevitably when money becomes worthless, when hyperinflation turns money into wallpaper, literally and figuratively, destroying its function as store of value and medium of exchange and unit of account, leaving people without the monetary infrastructure that modern economies require, forcing reversion to primitive forms of exchange, and demonstrating that monetary systems are more fragile than we like to believe, that the trust that makes currency work can evaporate rapidly once lost, and that rebuilding that trust after hyperinflation requires not just technical monetary reforms, but political transformation and institutional rebuilding and restoration of basic competence and honesty in governance, tasks that take years or decades or that may never be fully achieved, leaving societies scarred by the experience of watching their money become worthless, their savings disappear, their economic lives destroyed by policy choices that were predictable and preventable, but that governments made anyway. choosing short-term political expediency over long-term stability, and paying the price in economic collapse and social breakdown and political radicalization. The inevitable consequences when money turns into wallpaper.